Top of the morning to you, girls and boys. Today, this is a Tuesday lecture, and I'm here to talk to you about the hip. It's the only time I'm going to think of myself as being hip. This is the right hip circle. Notice the symmetry here, unlike the muscles of the shoulder, right? Kind of asymmetric. Remember, you needed a lot more things to do this for speeding up the hand so you could throw things and defend yourself and that kind of stuff. Here it's all about stability, guys. Mobility as well, but mobility through force, not necessarily mobility through mechanical advantages of speed. So there's a lot of symmetry here because at the end of the day, let me give you the so what about the hip. Now remember, we have modern medicine, so if you dislocate something, go to the doctor and they'll take care of you. You're not going to die under normal circumstances if you have a dislocation. But back in the day, our ancestors, that was not a good day, right? Here it's like, oh, it could be worse. Back then it's like, there's nothing worse. In other words, if you dislocated your hip, there's not much they could do for you. Here's another way of putting it. If there was an emergency here at Bourgeois, I can escape a fire, or I can escape danger with a dislocated shoulder. Run. I mean, I'd probably be, but I can get away. I can reposition my center of mass and move myself. If I have a dislocated hip, fully functioning upper extremity doesn't matter. So the point is that our body's understanding that hip stability is of super high importance to our livelihood. We are going to put some extra insurance policies in the hip to make sure things stay in their place. A few of these things we do as extra insurance policies for hip stability is big sockets, right? These big articulating sockets that kind of keeps the ball in place. Remember, shoulder, very narrow socket, like a golf ball sitting on a golf tee. A strong breeze can blow that golf ball over. Strong breeze ain't blowing this over. In addition, we have a big, thick ligament inside the hip called the teres ligament that helps to add stability. And then the biggest point, which this is kind of the parrot talk of all of my lectures, the role of muscles as joint stabilizers. You have a bunch of strong, tonic, tight, tone dense muscles that extra additional stability. And you think of all these muscles that cross the hip and they're pulling vertically. Yeah, they have some rotary component, but they're all kind of pulling up. And that up adds to the hip stability, okay? So a lot of muscles, a lot of even distribution. Stability is of high importance to us, okay? The muscles you guys are going to be accountable for, they're all listed here, a bunch of them, right? And some of them have only rotational function. That's going to be inside your circle in a circle, right? Remember, it's like a bowl. And a glass bowl, you could see through it, right? So if there was remember the other circle was a glass bowl. But the point is that this is a regular bowl, and that bowl sits on the bilateral axis and the AP axis. So therefore, it sits the fence. It has neither flexion nor extension function, ab or adduction function, right in the middle, and its only function is going to be to spin the merry-go-round, okay? I call them sharpshooters, meaning that in basketball, a lot of times sharpshooters, that's their only job. That's their only function, is to just stand out on the three-point line and just wait for the ball to come and then shoot. It's their job. A lot of times if they're really, really good at shooting, they don't really have to have another job. Just dude, when you're open, shoot it and make it. So those are uni-functioning sharpshooters who are only going to pull in the direction of hip external rotation. I'm going to teach you about them when we pull up those photos. Hip flexors cross the hip anteriorly. Hip flexors cross the hip in the front, pull in the direction of hip flexion. okay? Crossing muscles anteriorly is going to be our hip flexors. Lateral crossing muscles are going to be hip abductors. Medial crossing muscles are going to be hip adductors. Posterior crossing muscles, hip extensors. So hip flexors in the front, hip extensors in the back, to the front, to the front, to the back. Now dip, baby, dip, yeah. It's like my microphone. Dip, baby, dip, woo. Then you got your rotators, right? You got your internal or medial rotators, and then you got your external or your lateral rotators. Remember, medial and internal and the lateral and external is the same thing. Remember how that name got used or how that name evolved is that if I ask a child, and I said, hey, spin to your right, here's my right arm, they would more logically follow their right arm, spin to the left, to the right. Well, when you have an appendage that is your right or is your left, it's hard to tell a right to spin to its right or a right to spin to its left or a left to spin left, right to spin right. So it works when you just have one of something. Doesn't really work when you have two of something. So that's where the term lateral and medial came from. If I asked my right leg and I said, hey, right leg, spin laterally, spin to the outside, or as you perceive outside. Hey, right leg, spin medially, laterally, medially. And because you have two of them, you get this mirror effect. Laterally, medially, like a double door, right? In other words, the double doors are rotating two different ways globally, but they're rotating the same way locally, meaning that open the doors. They're both doing the same thing. They're opening. Close the doors. Lateral rotation, medial rotation. And lateral is the same as external, medial is the same as internal. So again, that's how those got their verbiage names. So hip circle, a lot involved, but again, you got a lot to do. Reason you got a lot involved is because they have a lot to do. Influence motion and do so while at the same time maintaining law and order of joint integrity or joint stability. Okay? So hip flexors are going to be anterior, hip extensors posterior, medial rotators are going to spin this way, lateral external rotators that way, abductors, adductors. Okay? Let me pull up some muscles and we'll take a look at them. A lot of them you're going to be familiar with because a lot of the hip crossing muscles ventured into knee joint land. So there's going to be a few new ones, but a lot of them are going to be the same, which is cool for us, right? Okay, let me go pull up some muscles. Be right back. I put my hand up on my hip. When I dip, you dip, you dip. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Stop. Muscles. View. Okay. Now I'm going to go turn off the light. Be right back. All righty. So a lot of cool stuff here. First one I'm going to talk about is this big rope-like muscle over here. And this muscle has a couple of parts to it. One is you have your psoas, the P is silent. Opossum, I guess it'd be the opposite of that, right? Possum, or the O is silent. The opossum psoas. So the psoas has a origin on your lumbar vertebra. Remember, the lumbar, as you work your way down your vertebral body, you get less and less mobile because more and more stable, right? The more you work your way up the skyscraper, the more and more mobile you have because that's the less stuff you got to influence. My head only weighs a few pounds. So I can afford to have a lot more mobility at the expense of stability. But as I work my way, as I slice my way down, there's more and more stuff these vertebrae have to hold. That's why, remember, the lumbar is like the lowest stories on a skyscraper. Those have to be denser. The top floors don't have to be as dense. And where do you build skyscrapers? On solid foundational bedrock. That's why we don't have skyscrapers in Lafayette, Louisiana, right? Our ground's soft. So we need bedrock. That's what your sacrum is, right? A solid foundation of which your skyscrapers can move. And remember, if you've ever been at the top of a tall skyscraper, it's really kind of freaky because you can actually feel yourself swaying a little bit. You have to give a little bit of motion or else it'll come crumbling down. Bedrock, lumbar, psoas. So the psoas starts on your lumbar, crosses anteriorly, and then meets up with his partner. I'd say partner in crime, but partner in function. And that is a muscle called the iliacus. And the iliacus is pretty easy to remember because it has this big broad origin on the ilium of the pelvis, okay? So iliacus joins with the psoas, and it becomes like a band, like the Iliopsoas. So like imagine like J-Lo and Benifer, right? Where you kind of take these two individuals and you combine their name. Did I say J-Lo? J-Rod, my bad. I'm rusty on my pop culture reference. So Jennifer Lopez and Alex Rodriguez, J-Rod. Iliacus, psoas, Iliopsoas. So the reason we do this is because these are sister muscles. They have the exact same function at the hip. So for the purposes of this class, and not only that, they actually insert in the same place. They anchor and pull in the same place, which is the lesser trochanter of the femur. So you see this little bony knob? Remember, that's what tubercles and tuberosity is. Fancy words for just saying a bony nub that muscles can kind of yank and pull on and give them a little extra mechanical advantage of pull. So this muscle, the iliopsoas, our combo of psoas and iliacus, crosses the hip in the front and then latches on to that nice little bony nub. So that way, when it pulls, it can yank in a direction of hip flexion. Okay. So iliopsoas is your first hip flexor. The next one is this muscle called the, nothing but high tech right here. Let me scoot the camera down. The pectineus. Now, I have to explain again the third dimension to these two-dimensional pictures. So in other words, a two-dimensional picture gives you great views of up, down, and left, right, but it loses the depth, the third dimension. So when you go and put on the 3D glasses and you see something coming at you, right? That's what we lose here with the 2D picture. So what I'm going to try to do is kind of recreate that third dimension. This part of the pelvis we know as the pubis. And the pubis is more out in the front, right? It's the front bone. It's the anterior bone of the pelvis. And then if you look at it, it disappears behind the femur. So here is a muscle that is running like this. It's coming out at you. So it's actually pulling the femur forward, pulling the femur anterior. So it's going to be a hip flexor. And then the second function is pretty obvious to see, right? It's adductor pull, pulling in the direction of hip adduction. So hip flexor, hip adductor, pectineus. He's a cool dude. All right, everybody's favorite muscle, the sartorius. Remember, longest muscle in the body. We talked about its knee function. Today, we're going to talk about its hip function. Crosses the hip in the front, so it is going to be a hip flexor. In addition, there is our rectus femoris. Crosses the hip in the front. There's other photos. Maybe at the end of the lecture, I'll pull up Google a couple of the photos that have the sartorius extracted. So chop it out so that you could see underneath, and you'd see that rectus going right up to the anterior inferior iliac spine. crosses the hip directly in the front, right on the axis, pulling in the direction of hip flexion. Okay. Remember last lecture I talked to you about length tension, right? Longer is stronger because of the stretchy stuff. This is a good example. Rectus femoris, hip flexor, knee extensor. So that's why when you go to stretch your hip flexors, right, and you extend the hip and you feed a little bit, you're like, I feel that stretch. What's going to take the paint off the wall was if you take your knee and you flex your knee. That's when violence may happen. If somebody's stretching you and they bend your knee a little bit too much, because that's really when you're lengthening this muscle at two different ends. By flexing the knee, you're stretching it as a knee extensor. And when you extend the hip, you're stretching it as a knee flexor. That hurts. Just thinking about it makes my mouth water. So the rectus femoris, hip flexor, knee extensor, because of its direction of pull. And then I say last, but the next muscle I'm going to talk to you guys about is really cool. The Tensor fasciae latae. It sounds like something you'd get at a Starbucks, right? Yes, I'd like a tall Tensor fasciae latae, extra cream and Dole Whip or whatever else they put on there. And oh yeah, I'd like the person ahead of me to pay for it. Thank you. The Tensor fasciae latae. I'm going to show you a couple angles of this because it's a pretty cool muscle. Has a lot of three directions of pull. First of all, the so what? It crosses in the front. It'll be a hip flexion. It also crosses lateral, so it has an anterolateral crossing. Its lateral cross is going to make it a hip abductor. And then its obliquity, its angulation, is going to make it an internal rotator. I'm going to go over all those separately, but the one you see best on this photo, this two-dimensional picture, is its abductor component, meaning the sartorius and the rectus cross right on the axis. Well, the tensor fasciae latae crosses lateral. So you can see how it would have an outward pull to the femur, okay? Here is another view of the TFL, or the tensor fasciae latae, an upper extremity functioning area of a muscle that would be like the TFL would be like the anterior deltoid. So imagine the anterior deltoid, the way it crosses the shoulder flexion pull, shoulder abduction pull, shoulder internal rotation pull. Same exact concept. Hip flexion puller, hip abduction puller, hip internal rotation puller. Okay. Now the TFL, the tensor fasciae latae, a very common muscle in terms of having problems in runners, because it does a lot. It gets innervated a lot, especially when you are supporting your weight on one leg. It works with the abductor group to prevent your pelvis from falling over. Athletic trainers know this as the Trendelenburg test, where you can have someone do a stork stand on one leg, and see if they kind of fall over because that muscle isn't strong as it needs to be. Maybe it's not their fault. Maybe they have nerve problems. Maybe they have other problems that muscle is super weak. But this muscle blends in to this big, long tractus iliotibialis, IT band, iliotibial band. And this band crosses the knee laterally, mostly to create this big, rigid band of lateral stability. What I mean by that is, imagine if you were shifting your weight, going side to side or changing direction. Man, you'd want some extra support to prevent your knee from blowing out this way. We call that varus stress. Valgus stress, varus stress, right? So having this extra band of stability laterally helps to keep our knee from buckling when we go to change direction, okay? So this band, if it's, I say too tight, its job is to be tight, but if it's super tight and you're doing a lot of flexion and extension, like in a lot of joggers and runners, that string, that band, that rope can pluck like a guitar string on the outside condyle of your knee, a little bony prominence of your knee. That's why sometimes when you flex and extend, you can feel like some little popping and grinding. It's not a big deal to play a guitar every now and then, but if you play that guitar too much every now and then, you got to change out the strings, right? Because you get wear and tear on those strings the more you play it. Very similar here, except we can't change out these strings. So if somebody is doing a lot of running, a lot of walking, that makes them flex and extend, and this band is going to pluck like a guitar string over and over and over, that may lead to some potential overuse injury problems. They call it IT band syndrome. One way to look at overuse injuries is, it's such a gradual progressional thing. It's really fascinating. If I tap on your shoulder, you're going to be like, hey, what do you want? Doesn't hurt. But what if I tapped on your shoulder for 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 2 hours, 4 hours? Eventually, it's going to leave a bruise. So when did the pain start? In other words, it was gradual progression. It wasn't necessarily one particular tap. They were all the same. It was just the sum total of a bunch of taps. Very similar with overuse injuries. It's the sum total of a lot of plucks of that guitar string, okay? So tensor fasciae latae, TFL, hip flexor, hip abductor, hip internal rotator. Okay. I'm going to get to the gluteus maximus in a little bit, or as my son used to call it, the buttomus maximus. Okay. Let's venture to the posterior compartment, the back compartment. We did these for the knee lecture. Hamstrings, right? Semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, but there's only one head that crosses into the hip. We have precedent for this. Remember, we're talking about the tricep. Medial lateral head doesn't cross the shoulder, only the long head crosses the shoulder. To have a function at the joint, you got to cross that joint. For me to actually influence the door, I got to cross the door. I got to cross the hinge. Unless I don't have Jedi mind powers, and I ain't Harry Potter. I have to cross into that joint to influence that joint. So anything that influences the hip has to cross the hip. You see this muscle right there? That's your biceps femoris short head. I'm going to show you a better picture of it. Okay. So this photo, we extracted the long head. We took it out. And you can see just the short head. So at the knee, it still does the same thing, right? Knee flexor, knee external rotator when the knee is flexed. But it doesn't go anywhere near the hip. So think about what I'm saying. It is incorrect. It is not truthful to say that the biceps femoris functions at the hip, because that's saying bi to sep head. Remember, cephalic, that's what it means, a two-headed muscle around the femur. If I say the biceps femoris functions at the hip, I'm saying both heads function at the hip, and that's not true. So how do I communicate what functions at the hip? I got to say which specific head. The biceps femoris long head functions at the hip. Okay, it's like saying if you had twins. Yeah, twins do a lot of stuff together, but they don't have to do everything together. Okay? Biceps femoris long head. So these are posterior muscles. They cross the hip in the back. That's not your pubis, that's your ischium, your sitting bone, right? When you sit down, that's the bone that kind of bears most of your booty weight. Booty weight. I gotta trademark that for a paper. That holds your booty weight. Hamstrings, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, long head originate on that ischial tuberosity. Cross the hip posteriorly. Remember, this is a three-dimensional concept. This is more in the back than this. And that's why it crosses posteriorly, meaning that it pulls. This is the femur, it pulls like this. It pulls this way. This would be hip flexors. These muscles that I'm showing you pull back here, hip extension pullers. Okay? So, semimembranosus, hip extensor. Semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, long head, hip extensor. Okay? All right, let's talk about our sharpshooters. Remember, sharpshooters have one function: shoot. Not just to shoot, but to try to make it. These are external rotation pullers of the hip who have, again, in terms of motion pull, they have one function. But there's other functions. Remember, rotator cuff muscles have stability pull to it. Well, if the golf ball is going to easily fall off the golf tee, we got to do something to make sure that it stays there. Or imagine this analogy. In football, most of the time, the kicker puts the ball on a tee and he kicks off, no problem. But every now and then, the wind is so strong that it keeps blowing the ball off. So what they do is they have another player come and hold football on the tee for extra stability. That's push from a finger that's produced by muscles pulling at other joints. Kind of same concept. Extra pull from the muscles, not just for motion, but for stability, to make sure that that ball stays inside. So you can imagine those sharpshooters pulling to pull that ball more onto the socket. In terms of their motion function, every one of those muscles, except for the piriformis, I'm going to get to the piriformis in a little bit, but here's the ball of the femur. This is the front. This is the back. External rotation pullers, external rotators, lateral rotators, pulling in the direction of external or lateral rotation. Now, you got to have names of these players, right? If it's a sharpshooter, they still have to have a name on the back of their jersey. I have to have a name. And listen, sometimes names are Smith and Broussard. Sometimes names are common. Sometimes they're not common. Right? So when you're watching the Olympics and you're watching players from Spain and from Portugal and from Russia, some different names. So same thing. You got some unique names here. You got some gemelli muscles. You got gemella superior and inferior, and you have some obturator muscles, obturator internus and obturator externus. And then you have this square-shaped femur muscle that pulls on the femur called the quadratus femoris. But one thing they all have in common is the external rotation pull at the hip, okay? And then you have your piriformis, apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. Your piriformis doesn't have a perfect horizontal pull. It's at an angle. It has obliquity. So the X component is horizontal, but it has a Y component that does something different. So your piriformis is going to be an external rotator, but also a hip abductor, pulling in the direction of abduction. Why the piriformis is so famous is because of anatomy. It's really cool. So as you guys know, piriformis stretch is kind of commonly used, right, to stretch out your piriformis. But why? Why piriformis? And that is because humans are like snowflakes, right? No two are alike. Some of you have muscles that I don't have. There's certain little muscles that some part of the population doesn't have. The piriformis passes in such a way that your sciatic nerve, big nerve that goes down to innervate all your leg muscles, some people, this nerve passes deep to the piriformis. So I'm going to use that piriformis, right? Look, origin insertion. So this is the rope. Some people's sciatic nerve passes deep. Some people's pass superficial. Some people pass through the muscle. It's fascinating. So if the cards played out where your nerve runs through that muscle, it makes sense how a tight piriformis muscle might pinch or occlude normal circulation or flow of that nerve. If it's deep, that tight muscle, in addition to a lot of sitting, might compress and cause problems in that nerve. Okay. Now, the cool thing about the piriformis, being that in anatomical position, it's an external rotator. You think about how your hip, when you do a piriformis stretch, you externally rotate. So that may go again what Dr. Campbell's been teaching you about stretching, right? If you want to stretch a flexor, you got to extend. If you want to stretch an internal rotator, you got an external rotator. But the piriformis is kind of one of our midway muscles. It switches rotation function based on the shoulder position. One way to look at this, if we go back to our pectoralis major, right? Below 90 degrees, it's pulling down in a direction of adduction. Past 90 degrees, it's pulling this way in a direction of abduction. Muscle's doing the same thing the whole time, right? It's just trying to bring this bone, humerus, to sternum and clavicle. If you're past 90 degrees, the shortest way is to go here. And if you're below 90 degrees, the shortest way is to go there. It'd be like a new TikTok dance. I'll hold that against me. So the piriformis is very similar. The piriformis, the way it runs, if you flex your hip past a certain range of motion, then the piriformis switches its function. So in other words, down here, it's an external rotator. But if you flex enough, well, now it's going to spin in the opposite direction. It's going to be an internal rotator. So that's why when people are doing the piriformis stretch, it's important that they flex the hip first and then torque and then rotate their hip to switch its function. Okay. All right. So what? Who cares? Give me what I need to know for the test. Function, piriformis, anatomical position, abduction puller, external rotation puller. Your gemelli, gemella superior and inferior, external rotation pullers, obturator internus, external rotation pullers, quadratus femoris, external rotation pullers. Biceps femoris long head, hip extensor, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, hip extensors. All right, gluteus maximus. It's a big daddy, right? Big, powerful hip extensor. For good reason. Explosive motions. It takes a lot of power. Remember, in mechanics or basic physics, power is a recipe that takes force and speed into account. Because if you're doing something powerful, you're having something that's relatively heavy and you're trying to move it as fast as you can. And the thing that the gluteus maximus has is a physiological and a mechanical advantage in power, because you weigh, when I say significance, your mass is a heck of a lot more than any dumbbell you try to move or any one segment you're trying to move. So in other words, if I'm trying to run, my arm segment is not a lot of stuff compared to my whole body. It's all relative. So when you're talking about extending your hip, that's a lot of stuff on top of that hip that you have to move with it. It's like trying to move a shopping cart full of groceries, right? It takes more force to turn those corners and to move. Well, that's what your hip muscles have to do. It has to move all the stuff in your shopping cart. Okay? So a powerful hip extensor, physiologically and mechanically. I'm going to get into the mechanical part when we go into some specifics about levers. But the important thing here is that this is no ordinary posterior deltoid. So the upper extremity equivalency of this muscle would be a posterior delt, right? A posterior delt, a shoulder extensor, abductor, external rotator. Well, the way the pelvis is positioned, if you remember, the spine of your scapula is very up here, very level, right? Well, here on the lower extremity version, it's very slanted. So you don't get as much of a abduction pull as you do the hip extension pull. And another thing that's obvious is the hip external rotation pull. So why would you need this big, powerful hip extensor? To vertical jump, man. You got to make that extension happen. To run and to jump. Powerful hip extensor. Okay, gluteus maximus. Powerful hip extensor. There's another photo just showing you its pull. It's a big, powerful muscle. Got to move a lot of groceries. Okay, gluteus maximus. In addition to having some ilial origin. So again, that's not a lot of origin on that ilium. Goes down into the sacrum and the coccygeal, mostly pulling in the direction of extension and external. All right. Last group of muscles, you have your adductor family. The adductor fam. So the adductor fam goes brevis, longus, and magnus. And it's the minimus is actually, these are some old pictures. And there's some debate about whether the minimus is its actual own separately innervated muscle or if it's actually just part of the brevis. So for the purposes of this class, I'm only going to give you brevis, longus, magnus. Think of it as increasingly getting bigger as you go further and further down the leg. Adductor brevis, right? Remember we talked about tendon length, brevis, longus, longer tendons. Longus. Magnus. Kind of sounds like some kind of transformer evolution. Brevis, longus, magnus, and then there's our gracilis, the sledgehammer, that goes down and crosses into the knee and does something. That's why it doesn't get an adductor name. Again, so much precedent. Vastus, vastus, valgus, rectus. Adductor, 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 gracilis. Okay. You should not miss a single adductor question on the test because the direction of pull is in the name, like the supinator muscle or pronator teres, pronator quadratus, adductor longus, adductor brevis. Now, does that mean its function is adduction? Oh, because I can observe abduction with these muscles being responsible for it if it's through eccentric work, being lengthened. Remember, the elevator is not called an elevator just because it brings you up. It also keeps you from falling down and it lowers you down. But the entire time it's pulling up. Its function is its direction of pull. Okay? The adductor group's function is its direction of pull. So in other words, whether those muscles are working concentrically, eccentrically, or isometrically, they're always pulling in the same direction, even though the motion may be different. Okay? Adductor group. The last ones I'm going to teach you is your gluteus, medius, and minimus. So let's see. How do I start? Your deltoid, I'm going to give you precedent. I think the easiest way to explain this is precedent. Deltoid, one muscle, fan shape. I got front covered, back covered, front covered, middle covered, back covered, right? And if you imagine a geisha fan, you know, I'm talking about little fans that you can unfurl. If I unfurl the fan, you're going to see fibers all. Imagine a peacock. Peacock, right? This is different. Your pelvis doesn't have, your pelvis only has, like, if you think about it from, let me find a side view. There we go. Okay. So side view. So the shell of your pelvis, the gluteus maximus is kind of hiding. Okay. So, you know, sometimes when you are at the beach and you find shells. And sometimes they're perfect, but sometimes they're broken, right? Sometimes you may find half a shell or a quarter of a shell. What's important to remember is that your pelvis kind of has a middle and a front, but not a back end to the shell. It's like a broken shell. It's not really broken, but just I'm talking about for function. Another way to look at what I'm trying to say is that your pelvis doesn't have like a spine of the scapula. It kind of stops a chromium clavicle and doesn't have a back part, just in terms of the ilium. The ilium has a middle part and the ilium has an anterior part, but the ilium doesn't have a posterior part. So the muscles that I'm about to show you, the gluteus medius and minimus, originate on the ilium. So there's a middle part and there's an anterior part. There's no posterior part. So let me pull the muscle back up. Okay. Again, lots of precedence with superficial and deep muscles, one serving as a pulley over the other. The medius is superficial, the minimus is deep. So this muscle is underneath that muscle. They originate on the ilium, middle and anterior part, cross the hip laterally and insert on the greater trochanter of the femur. So this is one of our fan-shaped muscles. You have upper pec, precedent. You have anterior delt, precedent. So you're going to also have anterior gluteus medius and minimus, meaning fibers in the front that do something different than the fibers in the middle. Now, all fan-shaped muscles have something in common. Traps, pecs, seen it all before. The function that the medius and the minimus have in common is hip abduction pullers. They are hip abduction pullers. They pull in the direction of hip abduction. And then just like with our deltoid, the anterior and the middle deltoids both pull in the direction of abduction, but the anterior fibers have a function that's different than the medial fibers. In the case of the gluteus medius and minimus, you may say, well, what's up with the anterior deltoid deflex? But the anterior deltoid was pulling mid-shaft of the humerus. These muscles are pulling on the head of the femur. So there's going to be no flexion pullers. It's just going to be rotation. In other words, the anterior fibers, because imagine if the deltoid attached on the head of the humerus, it would pull in the direction of internal rotation, the anterior fibers. Middle fibers would just pull in the direction of abduction. Anterior fibers would be abduction pullers and internal rotation pullers. So that's what this muscle does. The medius and the minimus pull in the direction of hip abba, and the anterior fibers, the front fibers, pull in the direction of internal rotation pullers. Okay? All right, guys, let's go to our circles. This is your last one, man. Are you excited? Yay! It's a busy circle. This is a class 5A classroom with a lot of students in it, but we talked about why. There's a lot of function, a lot of things for these muscles to do in terms of motion and stability. Who are your hip flexors? The muscles that cross in the front, anterior crossing muscles. Pectineus, rectus femoris, sartorius, iliopsoas, tensor fasciae latae. Some people color coordinate it, color them in. You can do it however you want. I just want right answers. Who are staying in the sagittal plane? Who are the hip extensors? Semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, long head. Gluteus maximus, G-max. Who are your hip abductors? Lateral crossing muscles. Tensor fasciae latae, gluteus medius and minimus, piriformis. What about your adductor muscles? Pectineus, and then your adductor family. Adductor brevis, longus, magnus, gracilis. What about your internal rotation pullers? Tensor fasciae latae and the anterior fibers of the gluteus medius and minimus. That's where you got to make a note. It's only the front fibers that pull in that transverse plane. The middle fibers don't. Who are my external rotators? Piriformis, gluteus maximus, sharpshooters. Gemellus inferior, gemellus superior, inferior, obturator internus, externus, quadratus femoris. Okay. How would you stretch the tensor fasciae latae? Think about what it does. What if I said, how would you stretch it in the sagittal plane? That makes life a lot easier. In the sagittal plane, it's a hip flexor. I need to extend the hip. In the frontal plane, it's a hip abductor, so I need to adduct. Transverse plane, it's an internal rotator, so I want to externally rotate from anatomical position. Okay. All right, muscles of the hip. Remember, Wednesday's lecture is going to be customized. Questions, clarifications, sample questions, practice. These lectures right here are the nuts and the bolts. So what? The follow-up lecture will be specifics. If you guys want specific examples, specific practice problems, we can look at some exercises and stuff. But these are the nuts and bolts. Or another way to look at it is these are the alphabet, and then you guys take these letters and form words and sentences, and then you come to me if you have any. Hey, does this sentence make sense? That kind of stuff. All right, we are done. Stay hip, everybody.